The night sky above the Karoo is unlike any other sky on Earth. Here, where the air is thin and dry, where the land stretches endlessly and emptily in all directions, the stars shine with a clarity that takes your breath away. The Milky Way arcs overhead like a river of light, and on the darkest nights you can see your shadow cast by starlight alone. Dr. Elsie Chen had travelled halfway around the world to see this sky. From the crowded streets of Singapore, through years of university in London, she had followed her passion for astronomy to this remote plateau in South Africa's Northern Cape. Now, 6 months into her research position at the South African Astronomical Observatory in Sutherland, she was still trying to make peace with the vastness. The emptiness here was different from anything she had known. In Singapore, you were never alone, always surrounded by people, buildings, the hum of a million lives happening all at once. Even in London, there was the comforting press of humanity, the knowledge that just beyond your door, the city pulsed with life. But here, in Sutherland, at an elevation of 1,450 meters above the sea, the land stretched away in every direction until it met the sky. The Karoo, the semi-desert that covered nearly a third of South Africa, was the place of such profound silence that Elsie sometimes felt she could hear the stars themselves. The town of Sutherland was small, barely 3,000 souls, huddled together against the immensity of the plateau. It was, people like to say, the coldest town in South Africa. Elsie had learned this truth the hard way during her first winter, when temperatures dropped well below freezing and frost turned the world silver in the mornings. But it was perfect for astronomy. The observatory, 18 kilometers outside of town, housed the Southern African Large Telescope SALT, a massive instrument with a mirror array 11 meters across. Elsie worked primarily with the smaller research telescopes, tracking meteor showers and studying the debris trails left by ancient comets as they crossed Earth's orbit. Tonight she was preparing for the Eta Aquariids, a meteor shower that would peak in early May, just 2 weeks away. The Eta Aquariids were special. They were the children of Halley's Comet, tiny fragments of rock and ice left behind as that famous wanderer made its 76-year journey around the sun. When Earth passed through this debris field, the particles would burn up in the atmosphere, creating streaks of light across the sky. For astronomers in the southern hemisphere, the Eta Aquariids were the best meteor shower of the year. Under perfect conditions, away from city lights, you could see up to 60 meteors per hour during the peak. Elsie had been looking forward to this shower since she arrived in Sutherland. But tonight, as she checked her equipment and reviewed her observation schedule, her mind kept wandering to the land around her. The Karoo was gripped by a drought. This wasn't the seasonal dryness that defined the region. This was something else, something more profound and more persistent. For the past 5 years, the rain had failed. The already sparse vegetation had withered. Farm dams had dried to cracked mud. The small towns scattered across the plateau were struggling, their boreholes running dry, their economies based on sheep farming collapsing as animals died for lack of water and grazing. Elsie had seen the effects while driving through the countryside. Dust devils spun across the empty veld, lifting red soil into the air. The hardy Karoo bush's succulents that could survive on almost nothing looked skeletal and grey. The few animals she saw springbok mostly, and the occasional herd of sheep were thin, moving slowly across the barren landscape in search of anything green. It made her heart ache in a way she hadn't expected. She had come here for the stars, not thinking much about the land itself. But 6 months in the Karoo had changed her. She had fallen in love with the emptiness, the silence, the way the light moved across the endless plains. And now, watching it suffer, she felt helpless. She finished her equipment check as the sun set, painting the western sky in shades of orange and purple. The air was crisp and cold, autumn in the southern hemisphere, the season when nights grew long and the temperature dropped sharply after dark. Elsie pulled her jacket tighter and stepped outside the small research building where she worked. The observatory complex spread across the plateau. with white domes housing telescopes, scattered buildings for researchers, and the massive salt structure visible even in the fading light. And beyond it all the Veld, empty, endless, beautiful and terrible in its vastness. She took a deep breath, tasting dust and distance, and looked up as the first stars appeared. It was 3 nights later when Elsie first saw the Maanspringer. She had driven out to a remote observation site about 30 kilometers from the main observatory, seeking darker skies for her preliminary meteor shower observations. The dirt road had been rough, her small car bouncing over ruts and stones, dust billowing behind her in the headlights. She had set up her equipment on a low rise overlooking a dry riverbed, which the locals called a riviera. However, Elsie suspected it hadn't held water in years. Her cameras were positioned to capture a wide swath of sky, ready to record any early Eta Aquariid meteors that might appear. Now, at 2 a.m, she sat in her camping chair, wrapped in a thick blanket against the cold, watching the sky. The Milky Way blazed overhead, so bright and detailed that she could see dark lanes of dust threading through the luminous river of stars. A meteor streaked across the sky, quick, bright, gone in a heartbeat. She smiled. The shower wasn't supposed to peak for another week, but scouts were already appearing. Then, in the corner of her vision, she saw movement on the ground. At first she thought it was a trick of the starlight, but no, there was something out there moving through the veld below her position, pale against the dark earth. Elsie reached for her binoculars and trained them on the movement. It was a springbok. But unlike any springbok she'd seen before, where the animals she had observed during her time in the Karoo were brown and white, marked with a distinctive dark stripe along their flanks, this one was almost entirely pale. Not pure white, but a soft cream colour, like moonlight made solid. Its horns curved back in the typical lyre shape, but they seemed to shimmer slightly as if coated in frost. As she watched, the springbok paused in its grazing. Then, in a movement that seemed impossible, it leapt straight up into the air. Elsie knew about pronking, the stiff-legged vertical jump that springbok were famous for. She had seen videos, even witnessed it once during a drive through a game reserve, but this was different. The springbok rose into the air 2 meters, 3 meters, impossibly high. Its back arched, legs held stiff and straight. And as it jumped, something extraordinary happened. Trails of light followed its arc through the air. Faint, silvery, like the glowing wake of a shooting star, but softer, more luminous. The light seemed to pour from the animal's body, from the white crest along its back, leaving brief constellations hanging in the air before fading slowly away. Elsie sat frozen, binoculars pressed to her eyes, hardly breathing. The springbok landed lightly and continued grazing as if nothing unusual had happened, but where it had jumped the plant seemed to glow faintly, touched by that strange silvery light. She watched for another hour as the springbok moved through the veld, occasionally pronking in those impossible leaps that left trails of moonlight in the air. Eventually, as the sky began to pale in the east, the animal moved away, disappearing into a dry wash where Elsie could no longer track it. When the sun rose, she packed her equipment with shaking hands, her mind racing. She had seen something impossible, something that didn't fit into any scientific framework she knew, something magical. Elsie didn't tell anyone what she had seen. How could she? She could barely believe it herself. In the light of day, driving back to Sutherland on the dusty road, she half convinced herself that she had fallen asleep and dreamed the whole thing. But she knew she hadn't been sleeping. And she couldn't stop thinking about that pale springbok, about the light that followed its leaps, about the way the very air seemed to shimmer in its wake. She spent the next 2 days researching springbok behaviour, reading everything she could find about leucistic animals, creatures with reduced pigmentation that appeared pale or white. Leucistic springbok were rare but not unheard of, but nothing she read explained the light, the impossible height of the jumps, the sense of otherworldliness that had hung in the air. On the third night, she drove back to the same location. She told herself it was for her meteor observation. She needed multiple nights of data from this site anyway, but she knew the truth. She was hoping to see the Springbok again. She set up her equipment and waited. The night was cold and clear, the sky blazing with stars. The temperature dropped steadily, and by midnight, Elsie could see her breath misting in the starlight. She huddled in her blanket, sipping tea from a thermos, her eyes scanning the dark veld. At 1 o'clock in the morning, the Springbok appeared. It came from the same direction as before, moving with the careful grace of all its kind, head low, grazing on the sparse vegetation. In the starlight, its pale coat seemed to glow softly, and Elsie felt her heart race. She watched through her binoculars as it moved closer. It seemed thinner than a healthy Springbok should be, and its movements, though graceful, had a quality of weariness to them. Then it jumped. The pronk was not as high as the leap she had witnessed 3 nights before, perhaps 1.5 meters, maybe 2. But again, that silvery light followed its arc, briefly illuminating the night. The trails hung in the air for a moment, then faded, leaving a faint shimmer on the ground where the Springbok landed. Elsie stood up, her blanket falling away. The Springbok's head snapped up. For a moment they stared at each other across the empty veld, woman and impossible creature, both frozen in the vast silence of the Karoo night. Then Elsie did something that surprised her. She spoke. "I'm not going to hurt you," she said softly, her voice barely carrying across the distance. I just want to understand." The Springbok tilted its head, and Elsie had the strangest sensation that it was considering her words. Its eyes, catching the starlight, were large and dark and filled with an intelligence that seemed almost human. Slowly, carefully, Elsie took a step forward. The Springbok didn't bolt. It watched her perfectly still except for the slight rise and fall of its breathing. Elsie took another step, then another. She moved carefully, keeping her body language non-threatening, the way she had learned during wildlife photography workshops back in London. She got within 10 meters before the Springbok made a sound, a soft snort, almost questioning. "You're collecting something, aren't you?" Elsie whispered. "That light, when you jump, you're gathering moonlight." It seemed like a crazy thing to say aloud, but standing there in the freezing Karoo night with an impossible creature watching her with intelligent eyes, it felt like the only truth that made sense. The Springbok made another sound, softer this time. Then, to Elsie's amazement, it pronked again, a gentle jump, barely a meter high, but the light that followed was the same. Silvery, luminous, like captured starlight. When it landed, the Springbok turned and looked at Elsie again. Then it took a few steps away, paused and looked back. It was an invitation. Elsie grabbed her jacket and followed. The Springbok led her across the veld, moving at a pace Elsie can match. It didn't pronk again, but every so often it would pause and look back, as if checking that she was still following. They walked for perhaps 20 minutes, moving away from Elsie's observation site, deeper into the empty landscape. The stars wheeled overhead, and Elsie found herself thinking about meteor showers, about cosmic debris burning up in Earth's atmosphere, about light and energy, and the way beauty could exist even in destruction. Finally, the Springbok stopped at the edge of a dry pan, a flat, cracked expanse where water had once collected during the rains. Now it was nothing but parched earth, the mud dried into geometric patterns, like a vast mosaic made of dust. The Springbok walked to the centre of the pan and stopped. It looked up at the sky, and Elsie followed its gaze. The moon was rising just past first quarter, its light silvery and soft. Then the Springbok began to pronk. Not single jumps, but a series of them, one after another, moving in a circle around the centre of the pan. Each leap sent trails of light into the air, and as Elsie watched, those trails began to weave together, forming patterns in the darkness. The Springbok was dancing, and its dance was creating something. A web of light that hung suspended over the dry pan, glowing softly in the moonlight. It was the most beautiful thing Elsie had ever seen. The dance went on for several minutes, the Springbok leaping and twisting, the light growing brighter and more intricate. And then, at the peak of the pattern, the Springbok made one final, impossibly high jump, 3 meters, maybe more. And at the apex of the leap, the web of light burst outward like a supernova. Silvery threads of luminescence spread across the veld, touching the sleeping world, settling over the dry earth like dew. The Springbok landed, trembling with exhaustion. It stood for a moment, sides heaving, then slowly sank to the ground. Elsie ran forward without thinking. She knelt beside the animal, close enough now to see the details of its coat, the way its pale fur seemed to shimmer even without movement, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from its body. "What are you doing?" she whispered. The Springbok turned its head to look at her, and in its dark eyes Elsie saw something that made her breath catch, understanding and terrible sadness. In that moment, without words, she knew. The Springbok was weaving dreams, taking moonlight and starlight and weaving them into dreams, then spreading those dreams across the dry land so that all the lonely, struggling creatures of the Karoo, the farmers in their farmhouses, the sheep in their pens, the wild animals searching for water, the insects burrowing in the dust would have something beautiful when they slept. But the drought was weakening it. The moonlight wasn't enough anymore. The Springbok was fading, using the last of its strength to bring comfort to a suffering land. "How do I help you?" Elsie asked, her voice breaking. The Springbok struggled to its feet. It was shaking now, barely able to stand. But it turned and looked toward the north, toward the dark silhouette of mountains barely visible against the stars. Then it took one stumbling step in that direction and collapsed. Elsie caught it before it hit the ground, her arms going around the animal's trembling body. It was lighter than she expected, as if it were made of moonlight itself, hardly substantial. "No," Elsie said fiercely. "No! You don't get to fade away. Show me what you need. Show me how to help." The Springbok's breathing was shallow and rapid, but it turned its head to look north again, toward those distant mountains, and somehow Elsie understood. There was something there, something the Springbok needed, a source of the light that sustained it. "Okay," Elsie said softly. "Okay, I'll take you there." She didn't question the impossibility of it, didn't stop to think about how she could transport a magical creature across the Karoo, or what she would say if anyone saw her, or whether she was losing her mind. She just knew that she couldn't let this beautiful, impossible thing die. Carefully she gathered the Springbok in her arms. It weighed so little, like carrying a bundle of silk and starlight, and began the long walk back to her car. The Springbok lay across the back seat of Elsie's car, wrapped in her blanket, as she drove north through the pre-dawn darkness. She had no clear destination, only the pull toward the north, toward mountains she could barely see, following an instinct she didn't understand but trusted completely. The dirt roads of the Karoo stretched endlessly before her headlights. She passed through tiny towns, Williston, Van Wyck's Vlay, settlements of a few hundred people at most, dark and silent at this hour. The landscape around her was painted in shades of grey and black, the veld rolling away toward invisible horizons. As the sun began to rise, she pulled off the road to check on her passenger. The Springbok was still breathing, but barely. Its pale coat had lost some of its luminescence, looking dull and dry in the growing light. "Hang on," Elsie whispered, stroking its soft ears. "Whatever you need, we'll find it. I promise." She gave it water from her bottle, dribbling it gently into its mouth. The Springbok swallowed weakly, then lay its head back down. Elsie checked her phone, no signal out here of course, and consulted her paper map. They had been driving north-northwest, following back roads that threaded between farms and through empty stretches of veld. If she kept on this heading, they would reach the Roggeveld Mountains, the high plateau where some of the smallest towns in the Northern Cape struggled to survive on sheep farming and tourism. But was that where they needed to go? She looked at the Springbok, hoping for some sign, but it just lay there, breathing shallowly, its eyes half closed. "Please," Elsie said, "show me." As if in answer, a beam of sunlight broke over the eastern horizon and fell across the back seat. Where it touched the Springbok, the animal's coat seemed to glow again, just faintly, and the Springbok's head turned ever so slightly to the northeast, toward the escarpment, toward the high country. Elsie started the car and drove on. By mid-morning she had reached the foothills of the escarpment. The land here was different, rockier, more broken, with outcrops of dolerite and sandstone rising from the veld. Small canyons cut through the plateau, their sides steep and shadow-filled. The Springbok had roused slightly as they climbed in elevation. It lifted its head, its ears swivelling forward as if catching a scent or sound that Elsie couldn't perceive. Then it made a soft sound, almost like a musical note, and struggled to sit up. "We're close, aren't we?" Elsie asked. The Springbok nodded. It actually nodded. Elsie pulled off the road where it narrowed to little more than a track. Ahead, the land rose sharply, becoming too steep for her car to navigate. If they were going further, they would have to go on foot. She opened the back door and the Springbok climbed out shakily, its legs trembling, but there was a new alertness in its eyes, a sense of urgency. It took a few steps up the slope, then looked back at Elsie. She grabbed her backpack, water, snacks, and a jacket, then followed. They climbed for an hour, the Springbok setting a slow pace that Elsie could match. The sun grew warmer as it rose higher, but up here on the escarpment the air remained cool and thin. The landscape around them was ancient and weathered. Rocks littered the slopes, some worn smooth by wind and time, others sharp and angular where they had recently broken from the cliffs above. The vegetation was sparse, small succulents, tough grasses, and the occasional stunted tree clinging to life in the cracks of stone. But there was a strange beauty to it. The rocks were layered in bands of colour, red, orange, cream, grey. The sediments of ancient seas and rivers laid down millions of years before. Fossils dotted the hillside, the preserved remains of creatures that had lived when this dry land was lush and wet. Elsie paused to catch her breath and look back the way they had come. The view stretched for kilometres, the flat expanse of the Karoo spreading southward, hazy in the distance, endless and empty. She felt tiny and very far from everything she had known. The Springbok made its musical sound again, calling her attention forward. It was standing at the entrance to a narrow canyon, barely more than a cleft in the rock. Elsie walked over and peered into the opening. The canyon was perhaps 3 meters wide at its mouth, its walls rising vertically on either side. Inside, the shadows were deep and calm. The Springbok didn't hesitate. It walked into the canyon, disappearing into the darkness. Elsie followed. The canyon floor was sandy, littered with fallen rocks. The walls pressed close on either side, their surfaces carved with strange patterns, the work of water, though these rocks had been dry for countless years. Overhead, the strip of sky was bright blue, almost painful to look at after the dimness of the canyon. They walked for perhaps 20 minutes, the passage twisting and turning, sometimes widening into small chambers, sometimes narrowing so much that Elsie had to turn sideways to squeeze through. The Springbok moved with purpose now, no longer weak or hesitant. It was as if the proximity to their destination was giving it strength. Finally, the canyon opened into a hidden valley. Elsie stopped at the entrance and stared. The valley was small, perhaps 100 meters across, ringed by sheer cliffs. But unlike the dry landscape they had travelled through, this place was green. Not lush, this was still the Karoo, but alive in a way that seemed impossible given the drought. Small bushes dotted the valley floor, their leaves thick and succulent. Grasses grew in clumps between the rocks, and at the centre of the valley, in a shallow depression, was water. Not much, just a small pool, perhaps 3 meters across, but it was water, clear and still, reflecting the sky like a mirror. The Springbok walked to the edge of the pool and stopped. Elsie approached slowly, hardly daring to breathe. The water in the pool was crystal clear and very deep. She couldn't see the bottom, even though the surface was so still it showed every detail of the sky above. And there was something strange about the light here. It seemed brighter somehow, more intense, as if the sun was shining through something that amplified its rays. The Springbok turned to look at Elsie, and she saw that its eyes were filled with hope. "This is what you need," Elsie said softly. "Water, but not just any water. This is special, isn't it?" The Springbok lowered its head and drank. The moment its muzzle touched the surface, the pool began to glow. Not with reflected sunlight, but with its own inner luminescence. The light was silver blue, bright but not harsh, and it seemed to well up from the depth of the pool, rising through the water until the entire surface shimmered like liquid starlight. The Springbok drank deeply, and as it did, its coat began to brighten. The dull, exhausted look faded, replaced by that ethereal glow Elsie had first seen in the darkness of the veld. The animal seemed to grow more substantial, more real, as if the water was filling it not just physically but spiritually. When it finally lifted its head, water dripping from its muzzle, it looked like a different creature, strong, vibrant, beautiful beyond words. It turned to Elsie and pronked a joyous leap, impossibly high, leaving trails of brilliant light in the air. When it landed, it made a sound that was almost like laughter. Elsie found herself laughing too, tears running down her face, overwhelmed by the beauty, strangeness, and absolute rightness of this moment. But her laughter died when she looked more closely at the pool. The water level had dropped, not by much, perhaps a few centimeters, but enough to be noticeable. And when she knelt at the edge and looked into the depths, she could see something that made her heart sink. The pool wasn't as deep as she had thought. What had seemed bottomless in the reflected light was actually only about 1 meter deep. And at the bottom she could see the source of the water, a crack in the rock, barely visible, from which the spring flowed. But that flow was weak, so weak that she could barely see the water moving. The drought was reaching even here, to this hidden sanctuary. The underground source was failing. "Oh no," Elsie whispered. The Springbok came to stand beside her, looking down into the water. Its joy had faded, replaced by that same sadness Elsie had seen in its eyes before. This pool was the source of its power, the wellspring from which it drew the light to weave dreams for the suffering Karoo. But it was running dry. And when it dried completely, the Maanspringer would fade away. Elsie sat on a rock at the edge of the valley, trying to think. The sun had passed its zenith and was beginning its slow descent toward the western horizon. The Springbok grazed nearby, stronger now after drinking from the pool, but not healed, not saved, just given a temporary reprieve. She had brought the creature to the place it needed, but that place was dying. What could she do? She was an astronomer, not a geologist or a hydrologist. She studied the sky, not the earth. She had no idea how to save a failing spring or bring water back to this hidden valley, but even as she thought this, part of her mind was working on the problem in the way she had been trained, methodically, scientifically, looking for patterns and connections. The pool glowed with its own light, not reflected sunlight, but something internal, something that came from deep in the earth. Underground stars, she thought suddenly. That's what it looked like. As if there were stars buried beneath the rock, and this spring was the place where their light could reach the surface. It was a fanciful thought, unscientific, but she was sitting in a hidden valley with a magical creature that wove dreams from moonlight, so maybe it was time to set aside her scientific skepticism and just feel. She closed her eyes and thought about light, about the way it moved through the universe, travelling across impossible distances, carrying information about distant stars and galaxies, about the way it could be bent by gravity, captured by plants, and reflected by water, about the way it connected everything. When she opened her eyes, the Springbok was standing in front of her, watching. "I don't know how to help," Elsie said. "I don't understand what this place is or how it works." The Springbok tilted its head, then turned and walked to the centre of the valley. It stood there for a moment, looking up at the sky. Then it pronked a single mighty leap that sent it 3 meters into the air. At the apex of the jump, it seemed to hang there for a moment, suspended against the blue sky, and the light that followed its arc was different, now brighter, more concentrated, as if it were pulling energy from the air itself. When it landed, the ground beneath its hooves glowed briefly. The Springbok looked at Elsie and made its musical sound again. Then it pronked toward one side of the valley, toward the cliff wall. Elsie stood and followed. The cliff was rough, layered sandstone, weathered. But as Elsie approached, she noticed something she had missed before. The rock face wasn't solid. There were cracks in it, vertical fissures, some wide enough to fit a hand into, others barely visible. The Springbok pronked again, and the light from its jump illuminated the cliff. For a moment, Elsie could see into the cracks, could see that they went deep into the rock, and in that brief flash of light she saw something else, movement, in the cracks, small things glowing faintly. She stepped closer and peered into one of the wider fissures. At first she saw nothing. Then, as her eyes adjusted, she began to make out shapes in the darkness. Small creatures, each no bigger than her thumb, were clinging to the rock face deep inside the crack. They looked almost like beetles, but their bodies were translucent, and they glowed with a soft, steady light. The same silver-blue luminescence as the pool. Star beetles, Elsie thought, or dream beetles, creatures that lived in the cracks of the earth and carried light in their bodies. There were hundreds of them, maybe thousands, all through the cliff face, living in the darkness, glowing like tiny stars. And as she watched, she saw that they were moving, slowly, almost imperceptibly. They were climbing downward through the cracks, moving toward the base of the cliff, toward the ground, toward the pool. Understanding dawned. These creatures were the source. The spring wasn't fed by surface water or by distant aquifers. It was fed by the beetles, by the light they carried in their bodies. When they reached the bottom of the cracks, when they touched the earth, their light somehow became water-liquid starlight flowing from the rock. But there were fewer beetles now than there should be. Many of the cracks were dark, empty. The drought had affected them too, somehow. Without rain, without moisture in the air, without the right conditions, the beetles couldn't thrive. And without the beetles, the spring was failing. Elsie turned to the Springbok. "We need to help them. The beetles. But how?" The Springbok pronked again, and in the light of its jump, Elsie saw more details. The beetles weren't just climbing down. Some of them were struggling, moving sluggishly, clinging to the rock as if they barely had the strength to hold on. They needed moisture, energy, something to sustain them. And that's when Elsie remembered the meteor shower, the Eta Aquariids, 2 weeks away, dozens of shooting stars per hour, all of them fragments of Halley's Comet burning up in the atmosphere. Cosmic dust falling from the sky, carrying the energy of the stars. "The meteor shower," she said aloud. "That's when we need to be here, when the sky is full of falling stars. That's what they need." The Springbok made a sound that was almost like a sigh of relief. It nodded, then pronked high into the air, leaving a trail of pure joy. But Elsie's relief was tempered by concern. 2 weeks. Could the spring last that long? Could the Springbok? She looked at the pool again. It was lower than before, even in the short time they had been here, and the glow from the depths was fainter. 2 weeks felt like a very long time. Elsie wanted to stay in the hidden valley, to keep watch over the spring, the beetles and the Maanspringer, But the Springbok had other ideas. As the sun began to set, the creature walked back to the canyon entrance and looked at Elsie expectantly. "You want to leave?" she asked. The Springbok nodded. "But you're safe here. You can drink from the pool. Stay strong." The Springbok shook its head, then it pronked, a gentle jump, and the light that followed settled on the ground around them, soaking into the earth. And Elsie understood. The Maanspringer couldn't stay here. It had work to do, dreams to weave. The drought-stricken Karoo needed those dreams, needed the comfort and beauty the creature brought to sleeping minds. Even if it meant weakening itself, even if it meant using up its strength, the Springbok would continue its nightly rounds. That was its purpose, its calling. "You're going to go back out there," Elsie said softly. "You're going to keep weaving dreams until the meteor shower comes." The Springbok looked at her with those intelligent, knowing eyes, and Elsie felt tears prick her own eyes. "Then I am coming with you," she said fiercely. "I don't know how I can help, but I'm not going to let you do this alone." And so began the strangest 2 weeks of Elsie Chen's life. By day she maintained her cover at the observatory, going through the motions of her research, preparing for the Ete Aquariid observations, acting as if everything was normal. But every night she drove out to the remote sites where the Maanspringer appeared, and every night she watched as the magical creature danced across the dry veld, pronking and leaping, weaving light into dreams that would settle on the sleeping land. She saw where the dreams went, saw the silvery light drift on the night wind toward distant farmhouses, toward sheep pens and shepherds' camps, toward the small animals burrowing in the earth, saw the way the land seemed to exhale when the dreams touched it, as if finding a moment of peace in its suffering. But she also saw the cost. Each night, the Maanspringer seemed a little weaker. Its jumps were not quite as high. The light it wove was not quite as bright. It was spending itself, using up the strength it had gained from the failing spring, giving everything it had to bring comfort to the Karoo. On the third night, they encountered the first of the other magical beings. Elsie and the Springbok were in a rocky area northwest of Sutherland, near the edge of a dry riverbed. The Maanspringer had just finished one of its dream-weaving dances when a sound made Elsie turn. Something was moving in the rocks. At first she saw only shadows. Then, as her eyes adjusted, she made out a shape, low to the ground, about the size of a large cat but longer, more serpentine in its movements. It emerged into the starlight and Elsie's breath caught. It was a caracal, one of the medium-sized wild cats that roamed the Karoo, but this was no ordinary caracal. Its fur was the colour of sandstone at sunset, and its eyes glowed with a soft amber light. Around its paws, small whirlwinds of dust swirled, as if the wind itself obeyed the cat's movements. The dust cat, Elsie thought, the name coming to her without conscious thought. The caracal approached the Maanspringer and the two creatures touched noses in greeting. Then the cat turned to Elsie, studying her with those glowing eyes. "I'm helping," Elsie said, feeling foolish for speaking to a magical cat but unable to stop herself. "The Maanspringer. The spring is failing. We're trying to save it." The caracal tilted its head, considering. Then it made a sound, something between a purr and a growl, and turned to pad away into the darkness. But before it disappeared, it looked back once, and Elsie understood. The cat would spread the word, would tell the other hidden things of the Karoo what was happening, ask them to help if they can. Over the next week, Elsie met more of them, the secret creatures that lived in the shadows of the drought-stricken land, struggling to survive but still holding on to their magic. There was the tortoise keeper, an ancient tortoise the size of a large dog, its shell marked with symbols that looked like star charts. It moved so slowly that Elsie first mistook it for a boulder, but when it spoke, and it did speak, in a voice like grinding stones, it shared knowledge of underground water, of secret springs that still flowed in forgotten places. There were the Scorpion sisters, 7 scorpions, each glowing with a different colour, who danced in a circle around a particular type of rock they claimed could draw moisture from the very air. They were small but fierce, and their dance left tiny droplets of water on the stone, enough to sustain the even smaller creatures that lived in the cracks. There was the Dust Devil, not quite solid, not quite air, a being made of wind and sand that could move across the veld at incredible speed. It didn't speak, but it understood, and it began to carry news of the failing spring across the Karoo, alerting other magical creatures to the crisis. And there were the Meerkat Dreamers, a colony of meerkats who lived in an abandoned termite mound, each one able to see the future in their dreams. They told Elsie that the meteor shower would be spectacular this year, that the sky would fall like rain, that it was the right time, the necessary time. But they also warned her the pool will be dry before the stars fall, the beetles will sleep. You must wake them when the time comes. How? Elsie asked desperately. How do I wake them? The head meerkat, an old female with silver whiskers, looked at her with knowing eyes. With light, she said simply. With your light. The light you carry in your heart. Astronomer from far away. The light that brought you across the world to see our stars. Elsie didn't understand, but she nodded and thanked them, and she and the Maanspringer moved on through the night. The days counted down. 10 days until the meteor shower peak. 7 days. 5. The Maanspringer was fading visibly now. Its coat had lost its luminescence. Its movements were slow and deliberate. Each night's dream weaving took longer, required more effort, and left the creature more exhausted. Elsie wanted to beg it to stop to save its strength, but she knew it wouldn't listen. This was what it was made for. What it was. 3 days before the shower, they made the journey back to the hidden valley. The pool was nearly dry. Where there had been a meter of glowing water, now there was barely a hand's width. The spring at the bottom had slowed to the faintest trickle, and the light that had filled the water was dim, guttering like a candle in its final moments. The Maanspringer drank what little remained, and Elsie saw tears running down the creature's face. She climbed to the cliff face and peered into the cracks. The beetles were still there, but most of them had stopped moving. They clung to the rock, their lights barely flickering, conserving what little energy they had left. Sleeping, Elsie thought, going dormant to survive, just like the meerkat said. She had 3 days to figure out how to wake them. Elsie spent the final days preparing. She brought equipment from the observatory, cameras, spectrometers, and things she told her colleagues were for documenting the meteor shower. She set up a small camp in the hidden valley, telling the observatory director that she wanted to capture the Eta Aquariids from a remote location from multiple angles. It wasn't entirely a lie. She would be documenting the shower, just not in the way anyone expected. The Maanspringer stayed with her, lying near the dry pool, barely moving. It drank the last few sips of water as they seeped from the spring, but it was clearly failing. Its breathing was shallow, its light was almost gone. On the night before the meteor shower peak, Elsie sat beside it, one hand resting on its warm flank. "I don't know if this will work," she whispered. "I don't know how to wake the beetles. I don't know what the meerkats meant about my light." The Springbok lifted its head with effort and looked at her. "But I'll try," Elsie said. "I promise you, I'll try." The creature made a soft sound and lay its head back down. Elsie stayed there all night, keeping watch as the stars wheeled overhead, the moon set, and the world held its breath, waiting for the dawn. The day of the meteor shower was perfectly clear. Elsie had worried about clouds, they could ruin everything, but the Karoo sky was cloudless, the air dry and still, the visibility perfect. She had set up her cameras round the valley, pointed at the sky. She had her spectrometers ready to analyze the meteor trails. She had everything a proper astronomer would need, but she knew that the real work would not be scientific. As the sun set and the stars began to appear, Elsie felt a strange calm settle over her.
She had travelled so far from home, from Singapore to London, to this remote valley in South Africa. She had followed her passion for astronomy across the world, and now, here in this moment, she understood why. Not just to study the stars, but to be here, now, for this. The first Eta Aquariid meteor streaked across the sky at 10:30, a bright flash against the darkening blue. The Maanspringer, lying by the empty pool, lifted its head slightly. More meteors followed as complete darkness fell, 10 per hour, then 20, then more, as the radiant point in Aquarius rose higher in the pre-dawn sky. They were beautiful, bright, fast, leaving glowing trails that persisted for seconds before fading, the fragments of Halley's Comet burning up in Earth's atmosphere, putting on their annual show. Elsie watched them with an almost painful joy. She had waited months for this, had dreamed of this shower since before she came to South Africa. But she couldn't just watch, she had work to do. She went to the cliff face and looked into the cracks where the beetles slept. They were still there, still dormant, their lights reduced to the faintest glimmer. "Wake up," Elsie whispered. "Please. The stars are falling, it's time to wake up." Nothing happened. Above her, more meteors flashed across the sky. The shower was building toward its peak, 30 meteors an hour now, maybe more. The sky was alive with falling stars, but the beetle didn't respond. Elsie felt panic rising. The meerkats had said she needed to wake them with her light, but what light? She had no magic. She was just a person, just a scientist with cameras and computers and theories about cosmic dust. She looked back at the Maanspringer. The creature had struggled to its feet and was standing at the edge of the empty pool, looking up at the meteor shower. Its pale coat caught the starlight, but there was no glow, no magic. It was using every bit of strength it had left just to stand. And in that moment, looking at the dying magical creature standing beneath a sky full of falling stars, something inside Elsie broke open. She understood. The light the meerkats had spoken of wasn't magic, it was something else, something simpler and more powerful. It was love. Love for the stars, love for this vast, empty, beautiful land, love for the strange and wonderful creatures that inhabited it, love for the mystery and the magic and the terrible fragility of all living things. She had come to the Karoo for the stars, but she had stayed for something more. She'd fallen in love with this place, with its silence and secrets, its harsh beauty and hidden magic. And that love was its own kind of light. Elsie closed her eyes and thought about everything that had brought her here. The wonder she had felt as a child in Singapore, looking up through the light pollution to catch glimpses of stars. The determination that had carried her through university. The moment she had first seen the Karoo sky and felt her breath taken away. The night she had watched the Maanspringer pronk and realized that the universe was stranger and more beautiful than she had ever imagined. All of it. All the longing and joy and fear and hope. All the love she had for this work, this place, these stars. She gathered it all inside her heart and let it fill her up. And when she opened her eyes, she was glowing. Not with a Springbok's silvery light, but with something warmer. A golden light, like sunlight, like dawn, breaking, emanating from her skin, her hands, her eyes. She gasped and looked down at herself, seeing the light pooling in her palms and how it made the darkness around her retreat. Above her, the meteor shower reached its peak, 60 meteors an hour streaking across the sky. The air itself seemed to shimmer with the energy of falling stars. Elsie turned to the cliff face and raised her hands. The golden light poured from her palms into the cracks in the rock. And the beetles woke. All of them, all at once, their lights flaring to life like thousands of tiny stars igniting in the darkness. The cliff face blazed with silver-blue luminescence, and Elsie heard a sound like music, like chimes, like the ringing of crystal bells. The beetles began to move.
climbing downward as they had before, but faster now, energized, purposeful. They flowed down the rock face like glowing water, and where they touched the ground, where they reached the bottom of the cracks and released their light into the earth, water began to flow. Not a trickle, not a seep. A rush of pure, clear water glowing with that same silver-blue light, bubbling up from the stone and filling the depression where the pool had been. Elsie fell to her knees, exhausted, the golden light fading from her skin. The Maanspringer walked to the pool, now filling rapidly, already 1/2 meter deep, and drank. The change was immediate and dramatic. The Springbok's coat began to glow again, brighter and brighter, until it was almost painful to look at directly. The creature seemed to grow larger, more substantial, more real. Its weariness fell away like a shed skin. And then it pronked. The jump was impossibly high, 5 meters, maybe more, and the light that followed was like the birth of stars. The trails hung in the air, weaving together, forming patterns of incredible complexity and beauty. They looked like constellations, like nebulae, like the very fabric of the universe made visible. The Springbok landed and pronked again, and again, dancing around the pool in pure joy, each leap sending cascades of light into the air. The light reflected off the cliff walls, off the water, off the very air itself, until the entire valley was filled with shimmering radiance. Above them the meteor shower continued, the Eta Aquariids painting streaks of fire across the sky, and somehow, impossibly, the light from the meteors and the light from the Springbok's dance began to interact, to harmonize, creating something new. Elsie watched, tears streaming down her face as the sky and earth seemed to sing together. This was why she studied the stars. This moment. This connection between the cosmos and the earth, between the vast and the small, between the eternal and the fleeting. This was everything. The dance went on until dawn, the Springbok pronking and weaving, the beetles flowing down the cliff face in an endless stream, the pool filling and overflowing, water running across the valley floor, soaking into the parched earth, bringing life back to this hidden place. And when the sun finally rose, when the meteor shower faded in the growing light, the Maanspringer came to stand before Elsie. The creature was magnificent now, fully restored, its coat shimmering with barely contained light, its eyes bright and knowing and filled with gratitude. It lowered its head and touched its forehead to Elsie's. In that moment, Elsie felt something pass between them. Not words exactly, but understanding. Recognition. A bond that would last forever, connecting an astronomer from across the world to a magical creature of the Karoo, united by love and wonder, and the shared experience of witnessing something impossible and true. Then the Springbok stepped back, pronked once joyously, powerfully, and bounded away across the valley and into the canyon beyond. Elsie sat by the pool, watching the sun rise over the Karoo. 3 months later, in the middle of the South African winter, rain came to the Northern Cape. Not a drizzle, not a shower. A proper soaking rain that fell for 3 days and 3 nights, filling the farm dams, running in the dry riverbeds, turning the brown veld green seemingly overnight. The farmer said it was the best rain in 7 years. The town celebrated. The sheep grew fat on new grass, and across the Karoo people reported sleeping better than they had in years, their nights filled with dreams of beauty and hope. Elsie, watching the rain from her small cottage in Sutherland, smiled. She knew where the rain had come from. She had seen the Maanspringer in the weeks following the meteor shower, had watched as the creature's nightly dream-weaving dances grew more powerful, the light more intense. She had seen the way that light seemed to gather water from the very air, to call moisture from impossible distances, to weave it into clouds that drifted across the sky. She couldn't prove it, would never try to prove it. Some things were meant to remain a mystery, but she knew. And on the night when the rain finally stopped, when the clouds cleared and the stars appeared again in their billions above the washed clean Karoo, Elsie drove out to her favourite observation site. The Maanspringer was waiting for her.
The Springbok looked healthy and strong, its coat gleaming in the starlight. Around it, the veld was transformed green shoots pushing up through the wet earth, the smell of growing things heavy in the air.
The creature walked over to Elsie and they stood together looking up at the stars. Elsie had learned so much in her months in the Karoo, about the land, about the creatures, magical and mundane, that called it home, about the connections between the earth and sky, between the seen and unseen, between the scientific and the sacred. But most of all, she had learned about herself, about the kind of love that could travel across the world and take root in an empty place, about the light that lived in the human heart, waiting to be called forth when it was needed most. She was no longer the outsider who had arrived 6 months ago, struggling with the vastness and the silence. The Karoo had claimed her. She belonged to it now, as surely as the Springbok belonged to the moonlight, as surely as the stars belonged to the sky. She would stay here, she had decided, would continue her work at the observatory, studying the stars, meteor showers, and the infinite reaches of space. But she would also walk the veld on moonlit nights, would keep watch over the hidden valley and the glowing spring, would be the guardian and witness to the magic that lived in this harsh, beautiful land. The Maanspringer pronked a single, perfect leap that left a trail of silver light hanging in the air like a blessing. And Elsie, looking up at the stars she had loved her whole life, felt complete. High above the Karoo, the stars wheel in their ancient patterns. The Milky Way flows across the sky like a river of light. Meteors streak and fade, cosmic dust burning bright for a moment before disappearing into the dark. And far below, on the vast plateau where the air is thin and the silence runs deep, a woman and a magical Springbok stand together, watching the heavens, guardians of wonder in a world that still holds space for mystery. The drought will come again, it always does in the Karoo, but the hidden spring will not fail now. The beetles will continue their endless journey down through the stone, carrying light in their tiny bodies, turning it into water, sustaining the magic that sustains the land. And when the nights are longest and the cold bites deepest, when the world feels too vast and empty and complicated, the Maanspringer will dance. We'll pronk across the veld in impossible leaps. We'll weave moonlight and starlight into dreams that settle like dew on the sleeping earth. Dreams of hope, dreams of beauty, dreams of connection between the earth and sky, between the lonely and the cosmic, between all the wandering souls who look up at the stars and feel less alone. Sleep well, dear traveller. May your dreams be woven with starlight. The Karoo watches over you tonight, and the moon rises on gentle hooves. Until our next story from the endless plains.